Jim was in the middle of a heated band meeting at Elektra Studios when Manzarek said the words that stopped his heart. "We're done, Jim. You're out." What happened next left 3 band members speechless and changed the Doors forever. It was March 15th, 1969, 6 days after the Miami concert disaster. The rehearsal room in Los Angeles felt like a funeral, thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of a career collapsing. They'd just finished running through Touch Me, Wishful Sinful, and Wild Child. But the music felt hollow, broken by Morrison's recklessness in Florida. The obscenity charges, the arrest warrant, the canceled tour dates. It was all too much. But what none of them knew was that Jim Morrison had already disappeared before they finished voting him out. Before we continue this story, if you want more untold stories about Jim Morrison and the Doors, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the mysteries that changed rock and roll forever. March 1st, 1969, Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami. The night that almost destroyed the Doors didn't start as a disaster. It started as arrogance mixed with whiskey and a death wish Morrison had been nursing for months. 12,000 people packed into a venue built for 7,000, the heat suffocating, the crowd already volatile before the Doors even took the stage. Morrison arrived 2 hours late, so drunk he could barely stand, carrying a bottle of Jack Daniels like a weapon he planned to use against himself. The band didn't know he'd spent the previous night awake, drinking with strangers, reading Nietzsche, talking about death and freedom and the price of fame, until his voice was raw and his thoughts were spiraling into territories even Pamela Corson couldn't follow him into anymore. The performance was chaos from the first note. Morrison forgot lyrics, insulted the audience, stripped off his shirt and threw it into the crowd, then started unbuckling his belt while screaming about freedom and authenticity and breaking through to the other side of American conformity. Witnesses would later disagree about what actually happened, whether Morrison fully exposed himself or just simulated the act. But it didn't matter, because the damage was done the moment he grabbed the microphone and started calling the audience slaves, started challenging them to be free, started destroying the carefully constructed image that had made the Doors one of the biggest bands in America. Manzarek tried to keep playing, tried to salvage something from the wreckage, but Robby Krieger and John Densmore both knew they were watching something die on that stage, watching Morrison immolate himself and threaten to take them all down with him. The police arrived 3 days later with arrest warrants, 6 charges including lewd and lascivious behavior, indecent exposure, open profanity, and drunkenness. Elektra Records was furious. Venues across America started canceling shows. Radio. Stations pulled Doors songs from rotation. The band that had defined psychedelic rock, that had pushed boundaries and explored darkness with artistic integrity, was suddenly being treated like a cheap strip club act. And Morrison, instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, disappeared into his West Hollywood apartment with Pamela and more whiskey, and refused to answer phone calls from anyone, including his bandmates, who were watching their careers dissolve because of one night in Miami. The meeting at Elektra Studios on March 15th was supposed to be about damage control, about crafting a public response, about deciding whether to fight the charges or accept a plea deal. But the moment Morrison walked in, 40 minutes late and still smelling like last night's bourbon, Manzarek knew they were past the point of salvaging anything. They'd been together since 1965, had created some of the most groundbreaking music of the decade, had survived Morrison's drinking and unpredictability and shamanic stage theatrics because the art justified the chaos. But Miami crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, threatened everything they'd built, and for the first time in 4 years, Ray looked at Jim Morrison and saw not a brilliant poet and performer, but a liability they couldn't afford anymore. The conversation started professionally. discussing legal strategies and publicity approaches, but within 10 minutes, it devolved into accusations and resentment that had been building for months. John Densmore brought up the Hollywood Bowl show, where Morrison showed up so drunk he vomited on stage. Robby Krieger mentioned the recording sessions where Jim was too wasted to remember lyrics he'd written himself. Ray talked about the interviews, where Morrison said things deliberately designed to offend and alienate, burning bridges with journalists and promoters who could help them. And Morrison sat there silent, drinking from a flask, his eyes somewhere else, somewhere dark and unreachable, until Ray finally said the words nobody thought would ever be spoken. "Maybe we need to do this without you for a while. Maybe you need to step away and figure out what you want, because this, what you're doing, it's killing all of us." Morrison stood up without speaking, grabbed his leather jacket and walked out of the studio. No argument, no defense, no emotion visible on his face. Just silence and the sound of the door closing behind him. For 30 seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, the reality of what just happened settling over them like ashes from a fire they deliberately set. Ray broke the silence first, said they needed to be practical, said they had contractual obligations and studio time booked, and they couldn't just stop because Morrison was self-destructing. John agreed, said maybe this was what Jim needed. Maybe hitting bottom would force him to get sober and serious. Robby was the only one who looked uncertain, who seemed to understand they'd just crossed a threshold that might not have a way back. Morrison vanished completely. Not at his apartment where Pamela was waiting with increasingly frantic phone calls to Ray. Not at the Alta Cienega motel where he sometimes disappeared to write. Not at Barney's Beanery or any of the Sunset Strip bars where he was a regular. Not at the film school library at UCLA or the bookstores on Hollywood Boulevard. It was as if Jim Morrison had been erased from Los Angeles, had stepped through one of the doors he was always singing about, and ended up somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow. Pamela called the police after 24 hours, but they wouldn't file a missing persons report for an adult who'd left voluntarily after an argument. Ray called Morrison's father, Admiral George Morrison, even though Jim hadn't spoken to his parents in over a year. But the Admiral said he hadn't heard from his son and didn't particularly care to, still angry about Jim's choice to become a rock musician instead of following a military career. While Morrison was gone, the Doors made a decision that felt practical at the time, but would haunt them later. They started auditioning replacement vocalists, not permanent replacements, they told themselves, just someone who could handle shows if Morrison was too unreliable, someone who could be a backup plan if the legal troubles got worse and Jim ended up in jail. The first vocalist was a session singer named David Alexander, 42 years old, technically proficient, but completely wrong. His voice too clean and conventional for material that required darkness and danger. The second was Michael Jansen, 22, a Venice Beach street performer who could actually match Morrison's range and had similar looks, long hair, and lean frame. But when he tried to sing "The End," it sounded like karaoke, hollow imitation without any of the shamanic intensity that made the original transcendent. The third day, March 18th, they were in Studio B with a third candidate, a blues singer from San Francisco named Thomas Reed, who Ray thought might bring a different energy to the material. They were working through "Light My Fire," and Thomas was doing fine, hitting the notes, delivering the lyrics competently, when the studio door opened and Jim Morrison walked in. He looked terrible, 3 days of not sleeping visible in his face, his clothes dirty and wrinkled, carrying a bottle of whiskey that was already half empty at 11 in the morning. But his eyes were different than they'd been at the meeting, no longer distant and checked out, but focused, with an intensity that made everyone in the room freeze. Morrison didn't acknowledge Thomas Reed standing at his microphone, didn't say anything to Ray or Robby or John, just walked to the other microphone in the corner and waited. Ray made a decision in that moment that defined the next 2 years of the Doors. He nodded to Thomas Reed, thanked him for his time, handed him $200 in cash, and asked him to leave. Thomas looked confused, looked at Morrison standing silent in the corner, and seemed to understand something was happening that was bigger than a simple audition. He took the money and left without arguing. The studio was silent except for the hum of equipment and Morrison's breathing, still heavy like he'd been running or fighting or doing something that had pushed his body past its limits. Ray sat at his keyboard. Robby picked up his guitar. John positioned himself at the drums, and they waited to see what Morrison would do, whether he'd apologize or explain or acknowledge the last 3 days at all. Morrison stepped to the microphone, took a long drink from the whiskey bottle, set it on the floor, and closed his eyes. When he opened them again and started singing, it wasn't one of their radio hits or commercial songs. It was The End, the 11-minute epic that had defined their early shows at Whiskey A Go-Go, the song about death and audible darkness and breaking through to the other side of sanity. But this version was different than any performance they'd heard before. Slower and more deliberate, Morrison's voice dropping into registers that sounded barely human. The lyrics stretched and twisted into new meanings. The Oedipal section delivered not as shock theater, but as genuine confession, as if Morrison was actually processing his relationship with his father and the violence beneath American suburban normalcy in real time. 20 minutes. That's how long Morrison sang without stopping, extending The End into territories they'd never explored, improvising new verses about Miami and failure and the death of dreams, about being kicked out and wandering and realizing that the person you thought you were was just another performance, another mask that eventually had to be destroyed. Ray kept playing, following Morrison's lead, and Robby added guitar lines that felt like they were scoring a funeral, and John's drums were barely there, just whispers of rhythm underneath Morrison's voice that had become the only thing that mattered in that room. Halfway through, Ray realized he was crying, tears running down his face, while his hands kept moving across the keyboard. And when he glanced at Robby and John, they were crying too, all three of them weeping, while Morrison stood at the microphone with his eyes closed, singing like he was exorcising something that had been killing him for years. When it ended, the silence was absolute. Morrison opened his eyes, picked up the whiskey bottle, took another drink, and finally spoke, his voice hoarse and damaged. "I can't promise I won't fuck up again. I probably will. But this, the music, it's the only thing that matters, the only thing that's real." Ray didn't trust himself to speak, just nodded, and that was enough. Morrison walked to the corner, sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and closed his eyes, while the 3 other members of the Doors sat with their instruments and tried to process what they'd just experienced, tried to understand if they'd witnessed a breakdown or a breakthrough, or maybe both simultaneously. They never spoke directly about those 3 days again. Morrison didn't explain where he'd been, though Pamela later told Ray that Jim had driven to the desert outside Palm Springs, had spent 72 hours alone in a motel room, reading poetry and drinking and confronting whatever demons he'd been running from since childhood. The replacement vocalist auditions were never mentioned, though Morrison certainly knew they'd happened, probably understood they were inevitable given his behavior. The Miami charges moved forward, would eventually result in a trial and conviction and appeals that lasted until after Morrison's death. But the immediate crisis, the question of whether the Doors could survive with or without their frontman, had been answered in that 20-minute performance of The End. But something fundamental had shifted in the band's dynamic. Before Miami, before the 3-day exile, there was still a belief that Morrison could be controlled or managed, that his darkness was performative rather than existential, that the drinking and chaos were just rock and roll excess rather than symptoms of something deeper and more dangerous. after that day in Studio B, everyone understood the truth. Jim Morrison was unfixable, unreliable, and absolutely irreplaceable. They were bound together not by friendship anymore, barely by shared artistic vision, but by the knowledge that the music they created together was greater than any of them individually, and that greatness required Morrison's specific brand of brilliant self-destruction. The remaining 2 years of Morrison's life with the Doors were marked by increasing tension and decreasing output. They recorded 2 more albums, Morrison Hotel and L.A. Woman, both strong works but lacking the revolutionary energy of their earlier material. Morrison's drinking got worse, his performances more unpredictable, his interest in being a rock star clearly waning in favor of his poetry and the dream of becoming a serious writer. He talked constantly about quitting music, moving to Paris, leaving the whole circus behind, and his bandmates, instead of arguing, increasingly supported the idea, recognizing that all of them needed escape from what the Doors had become. Ray Manzarek wrote about that day decades later, after Morrison was dead, and the Doors were history, and the whole 60s dream had curdled into nostalgia and corporate exploitation. He described that 20-minute version of The End as the most powerful performance he ever witnessed, said it contained everything that made Morrison both impossible to work with and impossible to replace, the darkness and the beauty existing in the same moment, inseparable and necessary. Ray also admitted the guilt he carried about voting Morrison out, even temporarily, wondering if that rejection had contributed to Jim's decision to leave for Paris in 1971, wondering if things might have been different if they'd found another way through the Miami crisis. But the truth, which all 3 surviving Doors members eventually acknowledged, was that Morrison was always leaving, always moving toward some ending he could feel approaching but couldn't articulate clearly enough to prevent. The Miami disaster, the 3-day exile, the return, and the tears and the performance. These were just markers on a path that had been determined long before the Doors formed, probably determined when Jim was 4 years old, witnessing death on a New Mexico highway, and deciding that reality was too painful to face without masks and alcohol and shamanic performances that let him be anyone except himself.